Thank you for joining us for another episode of Wake and Empowered TV. I'm Ethan Fox, and I'm here with Micheila Sheldan today. And we're doing our new show in this new studio that we've been working on for some time now. And we're going to take a little bit of different format today, in that we're just going to have a conversational style and talk about different topics and things that have been going on with us the last several years, as well as global events and what we foresee coming in the near future. For those of you who've been following our work for quite some time, you may have noticed we've been a bit more absent the last few years, a couple of years. And that's partly because of circumstances in the world, as well as we've been sort of going in a little different direction with some of our work, part of which is building this studio, and there's a second studio also being worked on. And as a result, some of our focus is going to change. And so I thought we could both spend a little bit of time bring you up to date on the last few years and some of the things that have happened, as well as some of the new directions that we're going with the shows that we'll be filming in this studio and the other one, which is probably going to be coming in about another 6 to 8 months.
Yeah, it's been an interesting couple of years. And I notice a lot of people on the planet are stepping back and then shifting direction and honing in on the service and whatever that is. And that was certainly, the case for me, for both of us, I think, because whether we want to, whether we like it or not, whether we want to admit it or not, we're in a really completely different environment than what we thought we would be in. Although it's interesting because if you've been following the channeling the last couple of years, the guys have been leaning into this. It just didn't all unfold in the way that we necessarily thought that it would. So for me personally, just taking a break and stepping back and leaning in a bit more to what the work is and how it can serve in these very unique times has been a big deal, for me. And those of you who are, doing the courses and, reading the book, none of that's changed. But, really, I think for me personally, how I interface with the work and some of the choices and the decisions that we make as an organization and Ethan and I together have been under review, let's just say.
Yeah, to bring you a little up to date, a few years ago or back in 2020, we were still doing our expo every year, and we did have one. For those of you who are unaware, we did have one planned that year in November, I believe it was, of that year.
Hmm.
And we ended up actually about 3 days before the actual event was to take place. The hotel which we had booked for the event, which was Hilton, told us that they're going to have to cancel the event as a result of the health department and the Detroit mayor, who decided that we wouldn't be able to have the expo. So we had to scramble at the last minute to shut down the event and make new plans for the future. We had to refund a lot of people. So and the main reason was, and a lot of this wasn't clear a few years ago, but a few years ago when we were doing the expo, we didn't have the information that's available today, which is showing a lot of the restrictions and requirements back then were not really based in any science or anything of that nature. But we sort of intuitively made the decision not to do the expo because the requirements were back then that we would have to contact trace everyone who attended the event, and also all the chairs had to be 6 feet apart and everybody had to be masked. And we weren't going to comply with those kinds of rules because they were go against our philosophies about self-empowerment and consciousness and so on. And so as a result, the only option left was they were going to cancel the event if we refused to follow those restrictions. And as a result, the event got canceled. And since then, as many of you know, people don't attend physical events as much as they used to, and venues, especially when we're talking about large mainstream venues, it's a little bit risky to book those venues now because there's every chance that the requirements and rules may change last minute, and Hilton and large venues like that may at the last minute change scheduling. So we decided to And many things, other things too, happened. Like a lot of our speakers over the years, and what we noticed was there was sort of a splintering that took place in the spiritual community in since 2020 until now, and it's still sort of there, which was sort of many different segments of the spiritual community split off. Some who were very pro-vaccine and masks and social distancing and all of those requirements, and many who really were more about sovereignty and freedom and independence, and that group went in another direction. So we had all these different fragments that the spiritual community split into, and as a result, a lot of people don't agree with each other. Even to this day, even though a lot of more information has come out and we can see what the actual facts are with regard to the science and those kind of things, even still, though, uh, a lot of people still are very splintered from what happened a few years ago. So, because of that, we decided to go back to the core of what we stand for and who we are, and instead focus on teaching directly to all of you the different things that we do and that we communicate about and that we've touched on in the past. So that's the reason why we've spent this time building the studio, and the other studio will also be focused on some other different kinds of education to help to empower you in these years ahead.
Yeah, that was quite a chaotic time, I think, for everyone, regardless of what you were intuiting, about how the world was changing. Because even though, we had this splintering and, people going in different directions, having events like that, you never really know what anyone else was expecting. And it was a very complicated, right, period of time to navigate. So I think you and I simplified that in terms of staying in the lane that we believed was most important. Well, I know many, many others did the same. And here we are, what, 2 years later, kind of coming out of it. And I think gaining a lot in terms of, you know, refining the work and moving in a direction that's really more, I think, authentic. And that's how I feel to who we are and what we stand for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we also encountered, as I said earlier, with the splintering of the spiritual community, even many people who we had on our YouTube channel, or who were speakers at our events, whether it be the Expo or local smaller events. There was definitely a splintering there that took place as well, where some of those teachers or facilitators went in one direction that we really couldn't support based on our own views and perspectives in the work that we do. So, so really having the kind of expos and events that we have had in the past decade doesn't really work with the current circumstance and mindset and philosophies that are becoming very dominant in the world today. And I feel, and Micheila through her channeling as well, that this sort of narrative or these belief systems are going to persist for a little while. And so as a result, that type of format of how we ran our events and also our various other programs is not as suitable as it used to be. So we're simply going to adjust and spend this decade until this cycle passes, focusing more on what we can bring to you directly, and with the interest of helping you to navigate this time ahead. Because I personally, from an astrological standpoint, and Micheila can speak to what she's seeing in the channeling, have found that um, this decade is going to be a bit challenging in many ways. And for those of you who've been following the various world events and are more aware of what's taking place. And this is something, interestingly enough, at the 2020 Expo, which we ended up having to cancel, was preparing a lecture, which I never ended up doing, which was about the Great Reset and the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab and all these things, which back then very few people actually were talking about, whereas now probably all of you know these things, and if not, these are definitely subject areas you should research if you want to be informed on why things in the world are taking place the way that they are. But at any rate, in that presentation that I was going to give in 2020, I was speaking about inflation and all the different control mechanisms that are being put in place that now we're living with a few years later. And so our goal here in these new shows that we're going to be doing is to create different kinds of education and knowledge and channeled information to not only help to understand history and how we got here as a world, but also going forward, how do you use various tools, spiritual tools, metaphysical tools, to enhance your life and also make this decade ahead a little bit easier or more self empowering so that we can all come out on the other end better versions of ourselves and going into it. Now, just to quickly speak about the kind of shows we will do, and then Micheila can also interject on some of that. We are going to be doing a number of different shows in this new studio, and some will be more conversational, where Micheila and I, and maybe even others, will be having a conversation about different topics, as this format will be. And we'll be expanding our audience to different platforms as well. We've primarily focused on YouTube and Facebook in the previous decade. And going forward, we're going to expand to various other platforms and podcasts and things like that. So we will have some conversational style programs like this one, but we are also going to have some channeling programs, some, for example, going back into ancient civilizations and archaeology and answering a lot of the questions that archaeologists and anthropologists are asking today and speculating, but don't really have the actual information to put the pieces together of the puzzles that they're starting to assemble on their own. So we'll go back to some of those ancient sites and ancient civilizations and answer many questions that I personally also have about the origins of these different locations and technologies and so on. So we'll do some shows like that as well. And then the second studio will be primarily for more of like whiteboard type of education and discussions and things like that. And we will still be having our monthly Flower of Life live streams where I'll be doing the energy transfer with Barb, and Micheila will be doing her channeling and taking audience questions as well. So some of the shows will be live like they used to be, but we'll have a lot more shows that are pre-recorded that'll be some audio and some video as well.
And for those of you who like to attend in person, I'm sure that from time to time here in the Detroit area, we will be doing the hands-on live events. But I also am planning on doing a podcast style book reading starting this year. And I'm really, really excited about that. If you found your way here and you have no idea what I'm talking about, the book Epitaium, the anthology of creation, is available on my website free of charge, and a lot of people are reading it, and a lot of people are requesting a hard copy or an audio version. And so my first iteration of that audio version will be a podcast style book reading, so I'm excited to do that. But I wanted to chime in on what you said about the 2020 Expo and the presentation that you are going to give about, Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum and all of this, which interestingly ties in to the channeled work, even though we don't often think about it that way. So for me, my huge awakening to everything that was going on in the world and even this channeling gift came with a message about reptilians. And that message has woven through many of my writings and my channelings throughout the years. But I think what we got in the last 2 years was an opportunity to really ground those concepts. What is reptilian consciousness and how does it manifest on the planet? And we got to truly see it in action. And for a long time, I think those of us in the spiritual community kind of, sat back and we were watching what was going to happen. And a lot of, channels and, others are bringing information through about things in the astral, right? We've got a lot of these astral wars going on, and such a collective is going to take care of the reptilians for us and bring them to judgment and all of this. But I truly believe, and what the channeling has taught me is that we are the ones who are here to not fight a war, but to actually come out of a very dense fog that we have been in for a very long period of time, where a select number of humans have been pretty much running the show and gaining from us a great deal of resource and energy for that matter. So even though, there were a lot of things that happened that were unfortunate and still are very unfortunate today, I think we saw very clearly how to make the connection between what we have learned in the channeled content and what's happening on the ground level. And that's where how to deal with it really comes in. And, where I think some of these shows that we're talking about will be more supportive, because we have to put some logic to this. I don't think we can just meditate it all away, even though that's an obvious important piece. The guides were talking 2 years back about us embodying and becoming more embodied in our spiritual practice. And to me, that's how we make decisions and how we live our daily life. And that is so powerful and such a huge contribution to the world today. And we forget that, I think, sometimes.
Michaela and I have these conversations a lot. The reason we decided to do this free form conversational format is because we're always having conversations about these different topics and our viewpoints from our slightly different backgrounds, and comparing our perspectives, and where she channels this information, what I see in the astrology and numerology cycles all lines up. And so I've spent the last few years, because of what happened in the world, studying more in depth into the cycles that are happening, that brought us here and where we're going. And I've talked about this in more detail in various other live streams we've done. But basically, I think that a lot of these problems or situations that we see in the world today have been a long time coming, of course. But really around 2000 is when we started to ramp up until now. And what happened in 2020 was, in March of 2020, there were several planets that aligned in Capricorn, and that was sort of the trigger that caused us to go into this, because Capricorn is represented by Saturn, and it really represents, one of the things that it represents is more of authority, or restrictions and things of that nature. Now, I should preface a little bit, and I should probably preface in all of the things that I do. When I talk about astrology and numerology, it may not agree with, if you have studied those subjects, some of the things that you might have studied, because my background comes from not only originally reading and studying these things from other people, but then spending the last 30 years really researching it myself. And because although I walk in the spiritual world, I'm a very grounded, practical person by nature. And I tend to use these tools in a very grounded, three-dimensional way. And this is something that I'll be teaching in some future classes that we'll be doing in the second studio. Really teaching you how to use these tools in a practical way, without becoming, without spending 30 years of your life trying to study it to learn it to that degree. Just simple things that you can do to just simply navigate your own life, to understand things better, and the timing of when things occur in your life. But at any rate, we are in this window now where Pluto is just now entering Aquarius, or about to enter Aquarius, and where it'll remain until 2045, I believe. And the last time Pluto entered Aquarius was in the late 1700s, which in the US, as many of you who are in the US may know, is when we had the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and all of those things occur. But it occurred, of course, right after Pluto was in Capricorn, and which was when the British were oppressing the colonies in the United States, or the various states of the U.S. And Pluto in Aquarius resulted in the breaking free from those things, and for a period of time, a freer country, you might say. And we're witnessing or experiencing and walking that life in a slightly new perspective, because every time a cycle repeats, it's not exactly the same as a previous, because consciousness has evolved for one thing, and secondly, uh, even though one planet may be in Aquarius, all the other planets are in different places as well. So every experience is slightly different, and technologically we're different. So many things will manifest in a different way, but the underlying meaning or experience is going to be more or less the same, which is essentially going from a more oppressive world into a freer world. And that's what we're going to experience between now and 2025. One of the things, anyway, is as a result of the restrictions that we just experienced in the world, we're going to see a breaking free of that. But in the interim, there's going to be this overlapping period for this decade, and I would say until about 2033, where both are going to coexist, where the authority figures or world leaders who have created this oppressive situation, and by created, I don't mean that necessarily they did it as much as they are just playing a role in the vibration of consciousness. So at this point, we were meant to experience this oppressive, more controlling, dictatorial experience on the planet. And so these individuals who came to the world to express those roles, people like Klaus Schwab and so on, are simply playing out those roles because that was what they chose to experience. So, but as a result of that, we will experience the breaking free from those oppressive situations. But in the interim, there's this overlap through the rest of this decade where we're going to see more of those oppressive circumstances coming into being. Meanwhile, people will start to seek ways to break free from those things. And ultimately, as a result, in the early 2030s, I believe we'll be seeing that tipping point where we move in the other direction toward more freedom as a result of having to push up against these restrictions. And we'll talk about that maybe a little bit more in detail in a minute, but maybe you can share a little bit about what you're seeing in the channeling or just intuitively.
Oh, yeah, so much. Well, I mean, what you're talking about here is a classic split of timelines, right? The guides have been talking about this since 2015. We didn't realize what that meant or how it was going to manifest, but it's essentially two different dimensional realities that do not mesh at all. So even though we're aware of the things that are happening in a timeline that we aren't really participating on and they can be of great annoyance to us, we really are setting up the framework for an entirely new reality. But ultimately, I think the manifestation of all of this was like the bursting of a bubble, and consciousness is what caused it. And so we have to kind of keep this in mind, which is, hard for us to imagine that awakening spurs this kind of instantaneous disintegration of the things that are no longer resonant with who we are. But that's ultimately why this extreme level of transparency exists and why we're seeing with such clarity all the things that we do, because you and I talk about this all the time. They've been going on forever. This stuff's been going on for such a long time, but now we're just seeing it with such clarity. And I think that that's a true advantage, because we've talked for a long time about mass awakening and this tipping point, but that doesn't happen automatically, right? There are physical components of that that are causing people to jump ship and to move in a new direction, even if it's just questioning, their current reality or choices that they have made in the past. But we all awaken through often a great struggle in our lives. I've heard that story over and over. And this is a time that's very collectively focused. So if I go back to the book, which really describes everything that's happening in progression right now, we go through these periods of personal evolution and personal growth. And then when so many human beings reach this, tipping point that we talk about, which I don't think has much to do with numbers, it has more to do with vibration. Um, it's like a tidal wave of change moves us in the direction of the collective, and we shift our focus to what's happening more on a global scale as opposed to what's happening in our personal lives. And so we kind of move in and out of that. And I think that that's what we're going to be experiencing really over the next several years is what's going on collectively is going to cause us to make a lot of radical adjustments in our personal lives. And then we're going to find that we are living in an entirely new age, in a different reality because of all these small changes that we're going to be making due to the global situation. There are a couple really interesting chapters in the book that I've read lately that apply to what we're talking about. And one had to do with material reality, like literally the things that we've manifested in our homes and our cars and all of these things. They were created by us long before we ever took possession of them, meaning we're assembling energy into material form. And so we have to keep this in mind because when our vibration changes, anything that matches that vibration is going to start to not make sense or to feel right, or we're going to question. And doing that on a collective scale is a really, really big deal, right? But also, you were talking about the astrology. And we discuss this all the time. Astrological influences are a container through which we can experience our lives. And there are many different dimensions in that container through which our plan can move and shift. We can be in the midst of a really difficult karmic time, and we can choose to walk through that experience in a higher vibration or a lower one, right? All of that is where our free will comes in. But interestingly, the guide said, we aren't just being influenced by the heavenly bodies. We are actually influencing them as well. And the entire cosmos is shifting based on how we choose to walk through these influences. So, Earth, Gaia, has been shifting herself. There's been a lot in the channeling about the great central sun and alignments with that, and plasma injections and the grids, which I can go into tons of detail on. But ultimately, we've been in a weird kind of position in the galactic universe. And imagine just moving incrementally a little bit and how that changes those influences that we are subject to. It's the strength and the intensity of them, right? So if we're moving into a new age with a human collective that is higher in consciousness, we must also consider that the planet is moving with us into a new galactic position that's going to serve everyone else. So that's why I say that tipping point, it isn't necessarily based, I think, on numbers of human beings. It's based on a vibrational equation and how we're working with the vibration in our lives.
Well, I'd like to expand on the free will idea because I think it's an interesting subject, and we'll probably get in trouble for our opinion, our viewpoints in this subject area, because it, in large part, goes against most of what we've been taught in the past several decades with The Secret and so on. And so I want to, I think we can talk about that a little bit, and also I'd like to share some of my personal journeys
Hmm.
in with regard to that, because back when The Secret, and some of you I may have talked about this in previous shows, but back when The Secret was still new, and I got the book and I read it, watched the videos, and at the time, which was well before our Flower of Life organization or Awaken Empower TV even existed, it wasn't even an idea that I was considering at the time. I was actually living a very mainstream life in business at the time, and in working in the financial markets and so on. So it's a very different life than the life I'm living today. But at that time, I was interested in law of attraction and exploring that. And at that time, I'd been an astrologer for almost 20 years or so, and about 15 years, probably 15, 20 years. And I was trying to resolve this idea of law of attraction with cycles, with numerology, astrology cycles, which I was um, more experienced in and had studied for some time. And in my mind, I was trying to figure out how can law of attraction work if cycles exist, meaning if you wanted to attract, or if it was possible for me to attract anything that I wanted at any point in my life that I wanted it, then cycles wouldn't work, because cycles would dictate at certain times certain things will be easier, or as Micheila was saying, that you have a container of experience. So every type of cycle or even numerological year would be a certain container of experience within which you could have a range of experience, but you still are inside that container, meaning you can't step outside of it. Because to do so would mean that you're overriding your soul's decision to have a certain experience. So, for example, let me use some of my personal stories from earlier in life. When I was in my teens to 20s, until about age 30, I was raised in an Indian family, and in that particular family, and in many cases in Indian families, there's certain prestige that comes with certain career choices, like doctor or engineer, neither of which I ended up doing. So I, pretty much went against all those traditional values in my family. Um, but money was also one of those things that was highly valued, and your reputation or credibility or even respect in the family came from the amount of money you made. And so some of those values were ingrained in me. And in my 20s and into my 30s, my primary goal was to become a millionaire by age 30. And I worked very hard, ran businesses, and by age 30, I didn't reach that goal. And now, if law of attraction were possible 100% of the time, then it should have been possible for me to achieve that goal with enough visualization and enough dedication to that outcome. But I didn't reach that goal. Now, when I got into about my 40s, was when or late 30s, 40s, was when I read The Secret. And I'm always the kind of person who, when I'm interested in something, I don't just scratch the surface. I like to jump really both feet in and explore it as deeply as I can. So I traveled to see some of the teachers in The Secret in person, to experience what they were teaching one on one or in an audience format. And that's when I first started learned about Esther Hicks and her law of attraction teachings and so on, and attended some of her events. And I also went and to several of the other teachers, including John Assaraf, who's in the Secret video, and worked with him directly one on one as a coach for me as well. And as a result of working with him one on one, I ended up in this group of about 12 or 13 people, maybe 20 people. It was a very small group, well, not a very big group, but the people in the group were all already very successful in what they were doing, and most of them owned businesses and or were investors of some kind, but they were all well off or would have been considered successful by mainstream standards at the time. And so I was in this group of people, and we were working with John Assaraf and some of his other staff as part of his coaching program. And now, John, for those of you who don't know, was really the foremost expert in neuro reconditioning and using visualization and vision boards and so on to manifest anything you want using the law of attraction principles. And he, by all accounts, having met him in person and seen his life and his house and these kind of things, he was living that life. He was a published author. He was famous. He was in The Secret. He was married, had this very big mansion, which was in The Secret film as well. And he had a really thriving business at the time called One Coach, which is a coaching model where thousands of people were learning these different law of attraction techniques. So by all accounts, he was applying these techniques and he was succeeding. And now what I observed, though, in this small group of people he was coaching, not everybody succeeded to the same degree. We were all following the same teachings. same things he was teaching. We're applying them. And I was very diligently applying those things that he was teaching, and as well as Esther Hicks and others. And what I found was the people in this small group, some of us became more successful, achieved more of our goals, and so on, and others pretty much stayed the same. And then there were others who went completely backwards and even went bankrupt in that span of time that I worked with John. And so my question that I came out of that was, which it took me some years to really answer, was, well, if law of attraction works and it's possible for us to attract anything we want at any time we want it, as really what the secret teaches, then it should have been possible for everyone in that group who was applying the exact same techniques taught by John to achieve everything that they wanted and to become more successful. Because nobody was in that group trying to become less successful. So, but that's not actually what happened. And that's when I really started exploring these ideas of law of attraction and cycles and coming to a better understanding of free will and so on. Because a lot of people, especially on planet Earth today, because we still are in, somewhat of a, because we come to Earth to experience ego as a human self, to have our human experience, we have this belief that we can do anything we want. But what we don't understand is that as a soul, we might not have chosen to come here to do anything we want. So let's say, for example, um, I want to be president of the United States right now. And I visualize this and I put it on vision boards and I meditate on it every day and so on. Doesn't mean I'm going to become president of the United States because, well, first of all, somebody else has that job right now. So I wouldn't be displacing them because it's part of their vibration to have that experience right now. And so by that concept, it wouldn't be possible for me to attract anything. Or similarly, let's say you want to be married to a particular celebrity, but that celebrity is married to somebody else and they don't even know who you are. No amount of visualizing and putting it on a vision board and thinking about it every day is going to produce that result because somebody else as a soul made an arrangement with that other soul to have that relationship in this at this point. So so I was really trying to understand this concept of law of attraction and how can we manifest anything at any time when the cycles don't always dictate that. And as a soul, well, maybe I didn't come here to become a millionaire by age 30. Maybe if I had done that, it would have taken me off course and I would have ended up somewhere else than where I ended up now, which is what my soul came here to experience. So in that context, these were some different conversations that I had. And to take it a step further, a few years ago when the Expo was canceled and we sort of pulled away from the public as much as we were before doing public events and so on, it was for me the end of a cycle. And so on the one hand, I can blame the world leaders for shutting everything down and ruining everything and causing our expo to be canceled and so on, or I can simply look at my own cycles and realize that they simply orchestrated something on my behalf that I was always meant to experience that time anyway. If they hadn't done that, then I would still be doing what I was doing a few years ago. Nothing wrong or right with it, but I was meant to change directions and do some different things, and that's why this studio exists and we're having this conversation today. But those are things that as a soul I chose and I put in motion when I came to this planet, and not necessarily things that the ego self, that is Ethan, may be able to comprehend. The ego self might say, well, I don't want those things to happen. I don't want to have the expo canceled. I want to keep doing everything the way that I was doing because it was working so well. But what we may not always realize is free will can interfere if it is possible for us to attract anything we want at any time we want. It can interfere with our soul's natural path and what we came here to do and experience. So ultimately, the goal is to get into alignment with our soul's mission and purpose in life, and that's where I find the most fulfillment is. And but anyway, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, and then we'll elaborate further.
Yeah, so here's what the guides have said about law of attraction. Interestingly, is every universal law becomes translated differently based on the dimension that you are in. So when law of attraction became very popular, we were in a very third dimensional materialistic vibration with a lot of false beliefs that came from outside of us as to what our preferences were or what we needed. So the very idea that by 30 you have to be a millionaire to be successful is not the innate essence of or reason why your soul came to planet Earth. So it's not that law of attraction itself isn't a valid law, nor does it lack any, ability to interface with your divine plan, which we're saying is astrologically, right, mapped out. It's a way of enhancing it, right? So what the guys talk about in the book is we've gotten so far away from our soul's truth because we're always outside of the present moment, and of course we're being programmed, right, by all of these things that are telling us who we need to be, what we need to do, what we need to accomplish. But if we were to step back from all of that and really be in the present moment with how we feel about things, who we are, what makes us tick, that is what activates the law of attraction. So we can go through those karmic periods and we can have this wave, which that's basically what the guides say is our astrological chart, is our divine plan is like a vibrational wave that's moving us through life with certain criteria, definitely, that we wanted to experience, things that we wanted to offer as a service to humanity and to others in our life, but also things that we wanted to understand better and replay from other lives that we've led. And those things are pretty much set in stone, and we can see them, right, in the numerology and the astrology. But I think what is really interesting is where our free will comes in, is to be willing to be on that path, whatever it brings us, and not try to jump out so far that we totally miss the opportunity to reap the rewards of what that plan is cultivating in our life, or what it's offering to us. So the guides might say, and I've actually done a lot of channeled courses on these kinds of topics in the last year because I think they're on the top of people's minds, is we don't necessarily plan out meeting one specific individual soul, one person with a name, but we have this kind of vibrational recipe that exists at a certain time in our plan where we need some type of experience, whether it's support and love, or whether it's something that causes us to look deeper within ourselves and become a stronger person. But where law of attraction comes in is we get to shape a little bit of that, right? Based on how we are providing feedback to source. So source is always looking at what's coming up for us and saying, these things are going to happen. We're pulling these things together. What's your contribution to that? How do you want to interact and interface with that? And I think that's the new translation of law of attraction. And it's not the only contributing factor to creation. And I think that's where we kind of got off the path as well. Because if we look at law of attraction as the end all be all of how we create, we can really get stuck in a lot of judgment. you know, uh, if we don't feel, which is the premise of a lot of my courses, in a real way and in a deep way, we're going to miss out on that experience we were meant to have. So if we're constantly trying to attract something, cleaning up our vibration to make sure we're going to get it, we're suppressing some real time emotion that's going to cause us a huge backload, I think, of density, which is something we're coming out of, and why things are so transparent right now. So we've raised our consciousness, and we've cleared the way, and we have this incredible, expansive viewpoint of the world. But if we're trying to attract way far out in the future, we are not shoring that gap really between, I guess, being quantum, right? And being in the present moment, and how that's really what our soul wanted. That's where the true, I think, satisfaction comes from. And we're filming this today on New Year's Eve, actually. And I just posted something on my wall today, something that I've taken away personally from a lot of the channelings I've done over the years, where the guides talk about transition and, will there be a judgment day? And will we stand in judgment of all of the choices that we made and use that judgment as the criteria for suffering in the next life? And the guides say you have it all wrong. When you're transitioning, you're looking at every moment you missed out on. It's not those big, huge things that happened that are at the top of our mind, especially as we're moving between years, that, we're either mourning or we're celebrating. It's those little moments that we missed out on, that we're so in awe of, that we say, bring me right back. I want to take advantage of all of those little moments again. So I think by its very nature, law of attraction can take us out of that state of being, which I think is kind of like heaven on earth, really. Not easy to
Well,
achieve.
let's talk about some actual practical, because I like to bring these concepts down to very practical, simple to understand, everyday truths. So let's just play around with this idea. So let's say I'm alone and I'm single and I want to attract a partner. And so I read The Secret and I follow the rules and I make vision boards of my ideal partner, or at least what I'm attracted to visually. And I visualize it in my mind. I create vision boards and so on. Will that always produce someone? Or if that's not something that's, say, in my cycles or in the wording that you put it earlier, would it not manifest if it wasn't meant to be? Or you were talking about a container of experience, right? So, and I would agree with that in the context of, like, for example, based on that concept, then we might not have met, right? But there
Right.
was a container there for us to meet somebody.
Right.
And so, based on our consciousness, perhaps, and maybe other factors, we could have fallen anywhere in that range, right? And might have attracted a partner who would have fit whatever we more accurately represented.
Right. So I want to interject here. That's what's interesting, I think, is yes, I think divine time 100% is always going to override what we think we need, because there's a higher power working through us, and that higher power knows more than we do. So we think we need a relationship in the moment, but we have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow, and maybe we needed the freedom to be able to help a family member or travel somewhere or do something else, right? So I think yes, that's always the case. But even the concept of the vision board and putting that up on a wall and saying this is the kind of partner that I want does not account by its very nature for a divine plan, because the person who comes in has to somehow satisfy your soul's need to grow. And we're not always thinking about that, and
Right.
it can be uncomfortable. I mean, and our relationship was not exactly comfortable from the get go. As soulmates, which I know many who are listening today have gone through soulmate relationships. A lot of
I'm not
that.
sure everybody knows that we are a couple, though, right?
Oh, I guess I take that for
Yeah, so
granted.
we might have to preface that. I mean, we really don't make a public show of our relationship, but for those of you who are unaware, we are actually a couple. So, and we have been for a few years now. And but anyway, so carry on
So
your story.
let's use that as an
Yeah,
example. If I would have put, no, this is going to sound offensive. I'm just using this as a very, raw example. If I were to put a recipe for the partner that I wanted or needed on a poster board at the time that we met, it would have been anything but you. Yet you were the perfect partner that I needed. in my life with across the board with everything, whether it was, the work or meeting on the same level. Who would have known what we were going to be facing the last couple of years, right? And to walk through a partner who has the same beliefs and, the same consciousness is just such a huge advantage. So the universe knows better. Only because, and I'll say this, only because we've been taken off track for so long with our own personal, I think, identity. Like the guides always say, we're taught to be the same, and that conformity is, it's rewarded, but that's not why we came to Earth. So if we can sink into that, then surely we would have known that this is the partner that we needed. But when that partner shows up, we tend to reject them because it's not what we've put out there.
Right.
Yeah,
And to extend that idea further, if you're not meant to have a partner right now, vision boarding isn't going to necessarily produce that, right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the same would be true for money or any number of other things you may put on a vision board. And this is what I've experienced over the years. And I've studied a lot of cycles of famous people and so on. And I did go back actually and study John Assaraf's astrology and numerology. And it just so turns out that he has certain influences in his own birth chart and numerology that would prone him toward being very wealthy and successful. And so looking back, I could make the argument that he didn't become successful because he was really good at law of attraction and vision boarding, and therefore he produced that success level. But he was always meant to experience those things. And if you understand your astrology and numerology charts, then you can see those patterns and you can identify ahead of time people who have a tendency or predisposition to have a certain kind of experience versus another. And to go a little further, some years after I stopped working with John, and I was also part of his One Coach program, the One Coach business that he was a partner in went bankrupt. So if John was so good at vision boarding, I highly doubt that he put bankruptcy on his vision board for his business. So we can see that obviously that was something that he was meant to experience so that he could go in a slightly different direction in his life as well. And had he been able to achieve everything he wanted through vision boarding, then he would surely not have put on there to fail at something. And so we have to look at success and failure that way. It's really not success or failure. And that's coming from someone like me who spent half of his life creating goals and lists of things that I'm going to accomplish every year, and understanding now that it's really not about that. That our life is on its own natural course. We don't really have to do anything to produce a particular result, physically speaking. Meaning, if we're going to be wealthy or affluent at a particular time, we may be born with those tendencies, or it may be something that passes through our chart at that time. If we're meant to fall in love and be in a relationship, that's something that we'll see in the cycles. And in fact, just to share a personal story again, when I first met Micheila, she actually came to one of the energy transfer events that I was doing about a decade ago or 9 years ago or so. And she came to the event and then came to me for an astrology consultation. And I noticed in her chart that there was a very significant relationship coming in, I think a year or two down the line, a few years, somewhere down the line. And sure enough, I mean, at the time, I wasn't thinking that it would be us in a relationship, but the cycle was there. And I was very confident that this was going to be a very significant, very important relationship, and that also had some past life ties as well. And sure enough, at the right time, things just kind of fell into place, which, much like she was saying, I wasn't the kind of person she would have put on her board. And I would agree, because I know the kind of relationships that she's had in the past, and I'm the farthest thing from that. And at the time that I met her, I was not looking for someone like her either. I wasn't really looking in because I was already on a different track at that time in terms of relationships. And actually, just a few or 2 years prior to meeting her, my previous relationship that had been going on for 9 years at the time fell apart. And I knew it was going to many years ahead of time because I could see it coming in the cycles, even though the relationship at that time was perfectly fine. So so everything fell apart just in time for me to change life directions, and then some years later meet Micheila, and her cycles also dictated that. So you could see from the cycles that this is a path we were always meant to take. So so free will does not allow us to 100% of the time apply the law of attraction to get exactly what we have on our vision board. Then what is free will? Then what do we actually have free will over? I know many of you are going to be very upset with us for having this topic today because we're taught in the spiritual community that we can attract anything at any time. But like for example, how many of you would have put on your vision board over the last few years that there would be a global pandemic or plandemic or however you want to refer to it that would shut everything down and people would lose their jobs, their businesses, and everybody would be in fear and the spiritual community would be splintered and society would go in some very erratic fear-based directions. I bet none of you had that on your vision board a few years ago. Yet it manifested and we went through that experience. And so if law of attraction, and if you look at, you don't have to listen to me, but even look at your own life. If you have actually used these techniques of law of attraction, how many of you have 100% of the time attracted exactly what you were trying to attract to the letter? So you put a particular person's picture on a vision board and you visualize it and meditated on it, and that exact person showed up and you end up in a relationship with them. It didn't happen. I mean, maybe in some cases it happened, but if it did, then it was just something that was part of your experience that your soul chose to have. So if we're making the argument here today that law of attraction in the conventional way that it's been taught does not work or does not work anymore because we've changed in many respects in consciousness, then what can we actually change in terms of law of attraction? Where does it actually apply? And this is a conversation I think that we could have now. So I'll let you talk about that a little bit first, and from the perspective of what you've already touched on, and then I'll throw in my 2 cents.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think when we talk about failure, that's another area we have to address because we think a relationship failed, we think a business went bankrupt when truly we're given an opportunity to move into a different reality and have new experiences. And that in itself is where I think free will truly comes in, is how do we translate and interpret and walk through the times when we got something that we didn't ask for. And so free will to me is moving through a container of experiences and having a choice as to how to deal with those circumstances. And certainly there's going to be some things going on that we don't have the opportunity to choose. I mean, if I had my way, there'd be a lot of things tomorrow I would, wipe off the planet completely. However, the impact of our own personal choice, as I mentioned earlier, is just so extremely powerful that I think the universe orchestrates these very complex experiences in our lives so that we do realize how we are creators in the midst of those really grounded circumstances, because that's what it takes, and I think law of attraction can carry us a little too far into the metaphysical. And believe me, I'm, hugely, obviously, as a channel into all of the metaphysics. But it's not the only reason we came. So if we came here to visualize and create our life and to only do this meditative astral type of experience, why be physical at all? Why would we choose to not know the future? And that was brought up in the last channeled course that I did. We get here, and as we inhale and exhale our first breath, we move from this hugely conscious merged state where we do have access, to all of it, to the Akashic records, to everything our life going forward has we've planned out. But we forget it not because we want to suffer, but because we want the surprise and we want the opportunity to navigate it however we choose. And that's truly, I think, the brilliance of free will is, we have this orchestrated plan that is perfectly designed for us as a soul to evolve, but we get to negotiate with it based on how we feel and how we choose to react and what choices we make.
Yeah, I'd like to share a personal story on that note
Yeah.
because so going back to what happened a few years ago with the Expo and everything, having studied my own cycles for my entire life and even going back from childhood up until now and understanding that certain cycles produce certain kind of outcomes for me. And now conventional astrology and numerology is taught in a very linear way, meaning this particular alignment or number always means this particular outcome. And I found in my more practical application of these tools that that's not necessarily always true. Now, every planet or alignment may have a particular framework or range of things that it'll generally manifest. But inside of that, there's a range of a lot of different ways that could actually show up in your life. And but what I did know was every 9 years, my life goes through a major transition, and it happens to everybody to some degree or another. Now, for me, it's almost as if every 9 years I live an entirely different life. So my previous life tends to fall apart and a new one begins. Having known that that was coming up a few years ago for me, that I was going into this transitional period when everything in the world shut down and we had to cancel the expo and all these changes occurred, I didn't stress out about it. In many ways, was expecting something to happen. I didn't know exactly what would happen because if I, as a human being, the human ego self, knew everything, then there would be no reason to experience life because I already would know what was going to happen before it was going to happen. So I still have to walk the path of my human experience so they can have the experience and grow through that experience. So even though the cycles were showing me that I was about to go through a very big transition where my former life as I knew it was going to come to an end and a new one was going to come, I didn't know exactly how it was all going to look. But when world events happened as they did a few years ago, and those world events impacted me personally, resulting in everything that I was doing coming to a screeching halt, I wasn't concerned about it. But instead, I just simply went with the flow of what that experience was and started allowing for that change to take place and becoming more of an active participant in it, as opposed to fighting up against it because, well, I didn't want things to end. And as a result, I intentionally pulled back from the public for a period of time, and because it was what I was meant to do, and instead focused on building the foundation for this new direction that we're going. So focusing on the studios and things like that. So when you know what the cycles are, then you can sort of navigate your life a bit more peacefully as opposed to fighting up against everything and trying to manifest something at a time when it's not supposed to. And also, if you know what the cycles are, you know what kind of visualization may work at a particular time. So if you know that you're going to attract a partner or there's a relationship coming, then you could then in theory apply law of attraction to do that, but the bottom line is you don't even have to though. So law of attraction is really not even necessary because if you're meant to have a relationship, you're going to have a relationship. And now, but what we have the power over is our state of being while going through that. So, for example, the last few years, I could have suffered and kicked and screamed because the world wasn't going the way that I wanted, and because everything I was doing fell apart and I had to start over. Or I could have acknowledged that this was something that was always meant to happen, and that some new experience was coming for me that I as a soul chose to have. And so I might as well be in a state of peace and a more positive state of being, and go through and embrace what is coming. And if what is coming is a new direction for the work I'm doing, then it's always going to happen anyway. And I think that's where a lot of us struggle in life, is we are always working against what is our natural life direction and what we're naturally meant to experience, as opposed to going with the flow of that, and understanding that anything that you're meant to have at any given time is going to be there. And there's nothing you need to do, especially to produce that. But would you say that it's that what we can change, though, is from a consciousness perspective? And so if I had been in any number of different consciousness levels right now, compared to, let's say, over the last 2 years, I might have produced any number of different outcomes, but they would have all sort of looked similar. Does that sort of make sense?
I think there are similar criteria that would be embedded in the outcome, but I think the outcome itself can be elevated, right? Or it can be somehow decreased in its amount of joy or satisfaction. And that can be applied to, I think, the last couple decades, right? I mean, look at the world. We're going to jobs that we hate to make a paycheck, and right, to do all these things. That we get married at a certain age because we have to. We have the 2 kids in the house, and those things are great if they make you happy, right? But we can take that and we can expand it into something more meaningful and more, I think, tailored to who we are. And I think that's, the true difference for navigating that stuff.
Yeah, especially over the last few years, I've come to more clarity and personal understanding about maintaining a higher state of being, and that the most important thing is to always to do that. And that can be done no matter what life you live. It can be done, and in fact, some of the wealthiest, richest people on the planet are the most miserable people. I mean, you can tell, because only miserable people would want to cause suffering for everybody else on the planet
Right.
for their own gain, financial gain or power, or whatever that may be. Because if you are truly an empowered human being, you don't need to take from anybody else. You don't need to cause suffering of anybody else, because you feel great yourself. Your life is everything you want it to be, and you can have everything you want. There's no reason to cause suffering for another human being or animal or anything in order to gain yourself. So just that frame of mind, or that state of the being that many of our world leaders and billionaires and so on have, shows you that money is not the path to happiness or fulfillment. And in many cases, it can be a path to the opposite. But I don't think money itself is the problem. It's just human nature. And so from that standpoint, you can be in a heightened state of being, whether you're poor or struggling financially or living in poverty, or you can also be a millionaire or a billionaire who is in this heightened state of positivity and well-being. That is something you can create in every moment, regardless of what's physically manifesting in your life. And you'll see this, a lot of people in the world who um, are struggling, or who have had very difficult lives, tend to be very happy, because they've just simply chosen to do that. And whereas some other people have the same challenge, are very miserable people and have given up on their life. And so the free will that you have at any given time is not about the physical manifestations in your life, because those will take care of themselves, because those are things your soul chose. But the free will is all about your state of being as you're walking that path through life, whatever that path would happen to be. Maybe that path is you're currently in a relationship or a marriage and it's not very happy for you, but you could be happy in some way, or find some way to bring happiness into your life in that situation, even if the relationship itself may not bring that to you. And that is how we can navigate through life in and use free will in a very practical way. Is that something you would agree with, or?
I would agree with that. But I think what being conscious does is it opens more opportunities to live in linear circumstances. So for example, I'll take bodily stuff because that's usually me. I'm dealing with a health crisis here or there. I've had pain in the past, and we get in this linear thought process of I'm either sick or I'm well. And if I'm sick, I am the only one who's going to make me well. So I have to fight until I am well. But we never stop to think that there might be a purpose to why we're having that experience, or a timeline that we're on that has a certain expiration date. We're going to meet certain people. We're going to learn certain things. It's really hard for us as humans to sink into that. But consciousness, it not only presents more options for being in that experience in a peaceful state, but with law of attraction, which is a universal law, it brings in more options in terms of manifestation, right? So we don't have to effort so hard to put all these specific things on our vision board. We can be open to observing our experience in these different dimensional realities. And as we do, source energy is gathering around us all of these various options. And so the second we're in non-resistance, we might just run into one of those options. And it may not be the end all be all of our healing, but it takes us on a new path, right? It opens up a new opportunity for us. So I think that's how consciousness plays in, because the big leap we're making right now is going from living in a more linear and restricted type of consciousness to being multidimensional. And being multidimensional requires us to look at life from these various vantage points. And in my last channeled course, I think it was Mary Magdalene, she used the example of the lens. We get to use the lens to zoom in and to zoom out and to consider all of these different things. And we can't be in resistance when we're doing that. It's kind of like questioning our own reality in the best way possible, because as we do, our vibrations pulling in the equivalent of what we are questioning about. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now let's talk a little bit about practical ways to get yourself into that state of being if you're not already there. So, as an example, the last few years of my life and all the changes that have taken place, certainly I could have struggled and kicked and screamed through all of that, or been miserable because, well, things were not going the way that they were before, and that was working perfectly fine. And so getting into that state of being can be very simple. It's in actual application, it can be challenging, but the techniques are very simple because, and I often, Micheila and I were having this conversation a couple weeks ago about how in some Buddhist teachings or spiritual teachings, they ask you to stare at a flower or something like that and contemplate it, and I didn't really fully understand that concept. I did it many decades ago until not that long ago. And it's just as simply when you come into the present moment of the beauty of that thing that you're looking at, if you can truly appreciate it for what it is, it snaps you into that state of being. And so it's not that complicated. Um, for example, a lot of new scientific research is showing that people who have bright colors in their homes tend to be happier and more optimistic, and even painting an entire neighborhood with brighter colors tends to reduce crime and increase people's social interaction and so on. And I find it interesting that I'm from India originally, and in India, um, at least back when I was there, which is quite some time ago. I imagine it's still somewhat similar, but in India, there are a lot of bright colors, and even in Bollywood films, a lot of very bright colors are used in their buildings and in their homes and in their clothing and so on. And it does tend to be a little bit more of a passionate sort of culture, I think. Uh, and I think it's interesting and you can see that in Bollywood films because they have, Bollywood films, dancing and singing is very central to the genre. Where in the U.S., it's very uncommon to see bright colors. I find, like in the interior of homes or cars or and so on. Where by contrast, in India, it's totally the opposite. And I think the culture here, and you can speak to that more, likes more calm, relaxing types of colors. But I also have wondered, does that lead to more tendency toward depression or pessimism or things of that nature? Because a lot of the colors here tend to be more muted and neutrals versus bright, more happy, lively colors that are used in India. So now, for me personally, maybe it's because I'm from India originally. I happen to like bright colors, and so just surrounding myself with things that are brighter colored tends to, or even artwork or things of that nature, tends to create or to reinforce this more heightened state of being. And I think it's possible for each of us to do simple things like that. Um, Maybe you can't afford to do that, but you can wear a shirt that makes you happy, or some brightly colored socks, or whatever it is that it does that for you. Or maybe grow a particular flower in your garden, or even just stare at one if you don't have a garden. There are lots of different ways to get into that state that can cost no money at all, or could cost a lot of money. It doesn't really matter. The point is the state of being is accessible to everybody, and I think in some respects meditation is one of those tools that can also get you into that state. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think everyone's unique in how they have to get there and certain patterns they have to break to hold that state. Here in, well, the United States, I know we'll have people watching from all over. It's a workaholic type of environment, and we're all ingrained, right, in this idea that we have to work really hard to achieve what we want. So when we get into one of these periods of time in our divine plan where things aren't going our way, for me personally, not doing anything to get where I want has been a huge component of breaking this pattern of getting myself off course and really even suffering, I think, because the more that we try to push up against the grain of right where our life is taking us, the more uncomfortable we're going to be. But in response to that, what's interesting is I've been hearing this common theme from people in my community over the last couple of years about laziness, or I feel like I should be doing more and I'm not doing something, or I'm overwhelmed by the idea of moving in the right direction. And guides are always talking about simplifying, because with consciousness comes more options, which is awesome. But we are inundated right now with so much information and options, and social media is showing us, all of these things we should be doing or could be doing. And I think we get wired in our minds that we have to get on this train and kind of go really fast. And that's never the case. If that plan exists and it's going to carry us exactly where we are meant to go, then relaxing into it without forcing is the best thing that we can possibly do. But I like what you're saying about kind of getting back into your roots, because this is also in the book. We've been programmed to believe that there are things that we want and need and love that aren't really the truth of who we are. And I have a lot of people that come to me in session that even say, I don't even know what brings me joy. I don't know what I love. And that's where you have to kick all of that noise to the curb and just, even for a period of time, be in silence. Don't do anything. Choose to not do anything, but don't judge yourself when you get there, because I think that's the two-way conversation we constantly have going on with ourselves is, when we simplify and when we rest and we say, well, I'm not going to push up against this and do, then we're wrong because we're not doing enough. So there's this constant kind of tug of war, I think, within ourselves that we're playing.
Hmm. Yeah, and I was just thinking about how if our soul chose a particular experience, and we were born at a particular time so that we would also have certain container
Mm.
of astrology, numerology cycles to facilitate our experience. So we're born at a particular time, so our astrology and numerology looks a certain way, and contained in that shows us some of the experiences we're meant to have. So, as an example, with John Assaraf, he was meant to be wealthy or rich, you might say, and well, that's what manifested in his life. It wasn't necessarily because he was an expert at vision boarding or law of attraction. It just was just a side effect of the fact that he came here to experience having more success and wealth and so on. And in the same context, the time when we're going to leave this planet someday, which is different for all of us, is also something that's preordained or that we set in motion beforehand. Because if, let's say, for example, all the world leaders today got their way, they would live forever. And they would just continue to rule and control and make more money and oppress the people even more. But even them, with all of their money and all of their knowledge, and they probably have access to ancient documents and teachings and so on, and may do all kinds of um, uh, things to try to enhance their lifespan or health that most of us would probably consider unethical. Even with all of that, they still are pushing up against the uh, centenarian, 100 years old, or maybe a little bit more than that at most. They're not achieving any better results than anybody else. They're our average people who live into their hundreds and beyond. So, so if that's the case, and we're leaving this planet at a particular time because we decided beforehand to do that. Now, many of you know that I'm a anti-aging longevity enthusiast, so these ideas may seem very contradictory. Why do I take these anti-aging supplements and follow these protocols if I know that I'm going to leave this planet at a predestined time that I already chose and I have no control to change that? That is true. But at the same time, if I'm somebody who, let's say, ends up living to 150 years old or 120 years old or whatever the case may be, then I'm going to have the behaviors that will support that. Meaning, if that is going to be my lifespan that I as a soul chose, then I'm probably going to be the kind of person who pays attention to anti aging and supplements and all these other protocols that extend my life to that point. And even if I didn't, I'd still do it. But I'd naturally have a tendency toward an interest in those subject areas, and that's why I follow these things. So it's hard to say what came first, the chicken or the egg. Is it? It's kind of both coexist. My behavioral pattern and preferences toward anti-aging and longevity may be just part of the fact that I may end up living longer or not. We don't really know. But if it's true that we're all here for a finite period of time that we chose, and some ancient pre-dynastic pharaohs lived for tens of thousands of years, and nowadays the average lifespan is maybe 100, a little over that, or actually it's probably more like 75, 85, something like that, right? Um, so if that's true, then why did everybody stress out over the last few years? If everybody was already going to leave the planet at a predestined time of their own soul's choosing, then why was everybody afraid of a virus and vaccinations and social distancing and masking and all this drama and things that everybody followed, or not everybody. We didn't really follow it, and um, but uh, but a lot of people followed, and uh, underlying that, of course, is the belief that, well, if I don't do these things, and I'm going to leave the planet early, or I'm going to die, or I'm going to hurt somebody else who's going to do that. But if we all understood how law of attraction works and how our soul's journey is on its own course, then we don't need to worry about these things. We don't need to worry about viruses or pandemics or even getting hit by a bus because, well, if we were going to get hit by a bus anyway, then it's going to happen, and there's no amount of whatever we do physically that's going to change that, because that was just our time to go. And if we're going to live to 150, it doesn't matter if there's a pandemic and you do nothing. And I personally didn't follow any of the restrictions in the last few years, and I'm still here. And so is Micheila. She is also here, and Barb as well. All three of us, different age groups, and yet we're all still here, and we didn't follow any of those restrictions. Yet many people who follow those restrictions did actually leave the planet the last few years. And so the question is, well, is it their actions that produce that result, or were they always going to leave at that time or not leave? And so they just chose certain things that facilitated that outcome to occur. So from that standpoint, there's no reason to have worried in the last couple of years or to take any measures to change anything, because it wasn't possible for us to die until the right time. And if that right time didn't fall in the last few years, it wouldn't have happened. And it also wasn't possible for us to harm anybody else. And so therefore we must get vaccinated to protect somebody else. Um, it isn't possible, because it isn't possible for my free will to impose upon another soul's decision to be here on the planet in whatever state of health for however long they chose to. So the last few years of everything that we did were completely unnecessary and produced no change in any outcome that wasn't already in motion and going to happen regardless. Would you agree with that?
I would add to it. I wouldn't necessarily say it was unnecessary, because
Right.
as a soul is creating its divine plan, as it's looking down on an incarnation and saying, these are the influences and things that I want to experience, it is in a collective state. So it knows it's coming to be a part of an entire human race. And the guides always say we don't create from nothingness. So there's a foundation for every experience that we have, and that is the spiral of time. So there have been many, many pandemics throughout history. And I think we have to address the bad stuff too, because we have a lot of people out there who might say, I never would have chosen that childhood abuse, as an angel. Well, I don't think we necessarily choose to suffer, but we know that we're interfacing with something way bigger than us. And when we see it, we think we're far bigger than who we come to be and who we realize ourselves to be oftentimes on the earth. We have to collide with that stuff, because how we choose within that container is going to determine how those events and experiences play out in the divine plan of future souls. So in the entire course of the last couple of years, every decision that was made has placed an imprint into the grid system, into this massive spiral of time that is going to determine how the next event plays out. But in addition to that, I think it's influencing very profoundly, our personal lives. And if we're progressing into more spiritually, conscious beings, we are going to be challenged to live that way on a physical earth. And so I think that was the gift in all of this, even though it's hard sometimes to see this experience as a gift, is that, we were given an opportunity to test out what we believed and to actually see if it worked. And for some it did, and for some it didn't. And, what you're saying is there may have been some predestiny in that. And I'm sure there was. I mean, for an event this huge, there had to have been a massive number of souls who volunteered to come in and play out certain stories. In the workshop I just did through Mary Magdalene, she was talking again about chronic disease or life-threatening disease. And she said, some people will choose a disease and not to heal. And it isn't because they want to suffer or they want the people around them to suffer. It's because there's an orchestration playing out between all of the souls involved in that experience, and they're all gaining something, learning something. There's an opportunity in it, and we don't know. Someone who passed on from a chronic disease may have left behind very advanced children who are here to become quantum healers, and this was their very motivation to do that and experience to create it. So these are the types of things that the guides would, add in to what you're saying.
Well, let's expand on that idea because you kind of jumped to the next concept here, which is a little bit more complex than what we were talking about earlier. So what you're saying is that what we've been speaking of up until now was law of attraction and the soul's journey in a very linear format, very flat plane concept. But what you're talking about is that every experience that we have and how we choose to have that experience feeds back into the collective consciousness, which then feeds back into our own experience as well.
Right, right.
And so, from that perspective, we are, even though from one sense we could say we're living this sort of linear existence that is predestined in a certain way, we are also multidimensional beings, right? So life is not a linear thing. But if I were, up until now, just purely speaking from a very practical third dimensional perspective, we can look at that from a linear, say, numerology cycle or whatever. But the reality is that it's more complex than that. And so if I choose to, or if I experience a certain thing a certain way today, that way of experiencing it is feeding it back into the collective consciousness, which then changes the rules of the game, really, in a matter of speaking, right? And then that may feed something back into my experience, not only this life, but future incarnations, past incarnations, and so on, which then makes available other possible realities or ways of experiencing life.
Right. The idea is, as we continue upward on this spiral, we're going to ascend as human beings or Pleiadians or whatever you choose to be and whatever reality you're focused into. And it affects universally all realities, not just here on earth. That's how big that's how important, everything that we are and everything that we do truly is. But, like to some degree, we have to consider that looking back, consciousness has not been at the level we've achieved today. I mean, well, we could go way back to ancient civilizations, obviously, expanded consciousness there. But I'm talking about, right, the last 10, 20 years. Unfortunately, we've been replaying a lot of these karmic events in karmic history because our consciousness was not expanded enough to walk through it and change it, because that's what consciousness does. The more we have these multiple dimensional viewpoints of what's happening, the more we're influencing what comes next, right? So it all kind of folds into each other, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to expand on this concept a little bit further. What you've been talking about is a very high level concept, and it's maybe a little bit complex for everyone to sort of distill down into their human experience. So let's say, and I'll just make up a hypothetical situation, or let's just use my own life as an example, which I've already talked about in this conversation. Over the last few years of everything changing, and now, at what type of thing did I do or could I have done that might have fed back into the collective consciousness and in what way would that have altered my path? So, like, for example, let's say my soul chose to put on the show today in this new studio. And, and let's suppose that over the last few years, rather than just gracefully going through that experience of transition and not stressing or worrying about it, but rather just sort of going with the flow of it. Suppose I resisted and I was kicking and screaming the whole way and trying to hold on to the past and worried about the future. Would that have altered anything?
I think to simplify it, anytime we break out of the expected pattern of how past events have gone for us before, we're opening up new possibilities. And those possibilities can be experienced by us in our reality, but will inevitably feed back into the collective human condition and the experience itself. So we can take something like pandemics or wars or financial crash and say each one of us going through that experience, breaking the norms of what would be expected before, or navigating the path differently than it ever has been before, is a way shower in changing it for future realities, changing past timelines, because we're all quantum beings, right? So it's hard to think about the past and the future, and I don't even think we really need to do that because it kind of takes us out of the context of what's happening here. I mean, there's been so many things that have changed in the last couple of years. I mean, even cryptocurrency, something that you talk about quite frequently, brand new concept, brand new idea. A lot of people didn't trust it at first. Some people still think it's crazy, but it's taken a very common experience like the Great Depression, for example, that's going to come back around and cycle through time and offered a new avenue or opportunity to navigate it. So if a Great Depression happens again, it's going to be lessened in its severity or changed in how it manifests, or it may inevitably we're going to struggle. We have to, because that's what creates the new. And I think that's the inherent issue that we've had for so many years, is that we've walked a very safe path, a very known path. And because of that, we're repeating these karmic circumstances in exactly the same way. But the second we step off that path and we try something new, or we invent something new, or we just create our lives differently, it can be as simple as bringing color into your home at a time when you would normally be suffering and in crisis. It changes the possibility of how that will happen again.
Well, let's use your example to expand the concept further and bring it down to more basic explanation. So, in many ways, I see cycles that are taking place now and over this decade that are similar to the Great Depression,
Mm-hmm.
and not exactly the same. So, the Great Depression had definitely some different alignments, but there are some similar things. And since I follow the global economic, macroeconomic picture as well, I can see the physical things that are taking place in the world that are sort of confirming that possible
Mm-hmm.
future. Now, are you saying then that because we experienced a Great Depression in the 1920s and 30s, that experience will change how we, or what is available or possible manifestations of the collective will experience in this potential Great Depression? Meaning it may not be the same, or it could be worse, depending on how people who experienced that time experienced it. Meaning, maybe they all went through a Great Depression where money was tight and people didn't have work and food and things like that. But let's say instead, one of two possibilities, in one reality, everyone suffered and were
Mm-hmm.
miserable and were in fear. And let's say in another reality, they still went through the Great Depression, they had no money and they couldn't find food, but they were very happy and upbeat and they helped each other and it was a more positive experience, but they still struggled financially.
Mm-hmm.
So you're saying that one of those two paths, which essentially was on the fundamental level was the exact same experience,
Mm-hmm.
but the individuals who went through it experienced it in a different state of being, that those two outcomes would produce how it'll show up this time.
Right. Yeah. No, yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I mean, okay, let's think back to Atlantis. I mean, there was probably no Great Depression in Atlantis. So what's the difference? Consciousness. we're always going to be expanding and contracting, expanding and contracting. I think that's a basic law of the universe. But what we're attempting to do is not allow that expansion and contraction to be so intense, right? So we're the ones who are smoothing out the bumps. Right. And as we do that, then we don't have to contract so tightly and then come back so profoundly. It's not that we don't want to have those really exciting moments, but what we're here to do, I believe, what we're here to do is to rid the planet of suffering, so that we don't any longer have to experience those very, very intense lows. Like the guys always say, we came here to experience contrast, but unfortunately, contrast became very hijacked for us. And we're in this really kind of narrow tunnel where what we experience is either or. It's conditional, right? It's either going to be really bad or it's going to be really good. And we're here to kind of navigate that in a way where we bring some peace, right? We bring that middle line in that big spectrum of, up and down. So the ups and downs might still happen because they're moving us through time. They're moving us through space and time. But we don't have to experience them in the way that we did before. We don't have to suffer as much as we did in the past. And again, I think multidimensionality, moving into higher dimensions with higher consciousness, means there are more options. So when these times come back around, we're going to have more and more opportunity to walk through them without having to feel the discomfort, right? Or the fear of what we have before.
Now, from your perspective and as a channel and what you've channeled, do you believe that the collective consciousness and maybe how human beings as a whole, or the people on the planet, everything over the last few years reacted to what actually happened, did that move us forward in a positive direction or a more negative direction? I mean, do you see what the collective experience is? It's hard for us to know
Hmm.
based on statistics and propaganda what percentage of people did this or that.
Right. Well, here's what's interesting, and these messages came through at the end of last year when I did the workshop called The Turning Point. If some of you may have been a part of that, it was through the Council of Light. And they were saying that, interestingly, those that were choosing a more restrictive path were questioning that path internally more and more, even if we as human beings weren't seeing evidence of that on the surface. And that is a huge vibrational shift that they're noticing. So any time that we are making a decision and then we're hesitant or we're questioning that decision, we're kind of creating a different path, right? So if we decide yes, we say yes to something, the no path still exists, right? So the no path is still there. So that's a good thing, even though we aren't witnessing it yet on the physical earth, the results of it yet on the physical earth. This has been a time of really mass awakening, they said. And the question remains, will those people who have questioned some of their decisions actually act on those questions, right? And that's what this period of embodiment is truly all about. So they're extremely hopeful because they see the changes going on beneath the surface, right? And a lot of this has to do, I'll take this up to an even higher kind of astral plane with the grid shift. And in the book, for those who are reading it and those who are not, focuses first on the idea that Earth has been encapsulated, meaning it's kind of been shut off and separated from universal support. And this is like Akashic energy, Akashic records, right? So things that have happened in past ancient civilizations, resources that we can use right now, ideas even from the future that we can bring into this reality have not been available to us because Earth's grids were kind of broken and dismantled and encapsulated in this energy, which has now completely changed. And they give us reports on that all the time. And there's probably some grid workers out there who are watching this video who know exactly what I'm talking about, speaking their language. There's a new grid system. and it's pulling Earth back into a beneficial position where we have more access to information. So awakening is one thing. We question our reality. We become more awakened to new things, but the accessibility to that energy or that information was also the second piece, and that's what's drastically changing as well, which I think is a huge positive for us.
You mentioned Atlantis also, and I know you've talked many times about like many aspects of where we are as a civilization today is Atlantean in nature, sort of like a repeat of that timeline, but
Right.
different. How do you see it being similar or different?
I kind of see where we're at being a reverse, moving from the fall back into the Atlantean age. And there's so many
No, the
different,
fall, you mean by the fall, meaning the end of Atlantis,
yeah,
the collapse of the
the
civilization.
collapse.
Okay. So
Yeah.
we're starting there and going back to when they were a more enlightened society, you mean? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what the guides have brought in. And in a lot of my private sessions too, we have a lot of souls who incarnated on Earth who are very Atlantean in nature and were there and experienced a lot of that and are here again, leading the way back to that kind of, philosophy or community. It's very complex, but a lot of it does have to do with technology. And some of what I've channeled is that the technology in Atlantis was free energy, right? It was using the energy of nature, water, huge. They used water as a natural resource to raise consciousness. So where we have these kind of 5G towers that are sending really negative signals, they were using natural elements, crystal beds, water to supercharge their environment and keep it as a very high resonance, high frequency community. But unfortunately, some very malevolent forces got their hands on these technologies and wanted to use them for their own benefit. And there were a lot of genetic manipulations that took place, and I think this was the start, right, of the fall. So we can see all of those very common elements in what's happening today with, the genetics, with the technology and AI. And we really do have this kind of vulnerable situation here where it can go either way. I personally believe we're going in the right direction. And actually, I know you have met some of the crystal kids that we've worked with who I think are here for that very purpose. I do believe they're going to take what exists today and turn it into that high vibrational healing type of beneficial technology again. And we can see the start of that too. That possibility exists.
Yeah, I see that too. And I think the future is very bright, although we may have this sort of temporary window of years where there may be a push and pull going on. We'll certainly expand on these ideas in upcoming shows and other channeled events and so on. So this is going to be our new format, and you'll see a lot more content and a lot more different videos and different types of shows. I hope you like this new format that we're trying out today, and if so, we'll be doing more like this intermixed with other types of programs as well.
Thank you for joining us for this new show and format that we've put out here on New Year's Eve. You'll be getting it a little bit later, but we want to wish you the best of the new year. And hopefully you'll stay with us for all of the new events and podcasts and things we have coming up. Look for our Flower of Life live streams coming back as well. We'll have one of those in a couple of weeks. And take care.